Today, I would like to shed light on events that have not yet been made public, since this is truly a stain on the reputation of the Soviet Army in a war that is already considered senseless and inglorious. And today we will talk about, and I am not afraid to use this word, the atrocities committed by the Soviets during the 10 years of slaughter against the local population in Afghanistan. There are already several videos on my channel about the events of that international mission of the Soviet Army. By the way, just like almost half a century ago, the Kremlin is still avoiding the word war, supposedly saving the Afghan people back then, and now the Ukrainian people. So, in this episode, I will focus exclusively on the facts of inhumane treatment of the locals by the Soviet Army. This topic is not an easy one, because many of those who took part in that conflict are still alive, and back then, influenced by propaganda, they sincerely believed they were bringing good to a friendly nation. However, I cannot remain silent about the unacceptable actions taken first and foremost against unarmed people. I'm Semyon from Megashow Television. Let's start. Genocide cases during the invasion's early years. I want to note right away that it's impossible to find the evidence I'll present today on Russian websites. In my research, I will rely on eyewitness accounts, articles from foreign newspapers of those years, and books that contain reports on documented cases of genocide, as is known among the military. There are laws that are necessary to mitigate the devastating consequences of pandemics as much as possible by prohibiting unnecessary cruelty and other actions that bring death and destruction and have no reasonable connection to the conduct of military operations. And these laws, first and foremost, include the prohibition of killing civilians, destroying their sources of livelihood, and any actions that force people to flee abroad in search of safety. This is all a crime and an unjustified military necessity. The killing of civilians began to be recorded starting in 1980 when the Mujahideen disrupted the plans of the Moscow invaders for a quick conquest of the country. At the end of May 1980, during an operation in Ghazni province, at least 30 villagers were killed because of the battle between the Mujahideen and the occupiers. Locals sheltered in an underground canal called Kariz, where the Soviet army poisoned them with unknown chemicals. But we will return to examples of this barbaric method later. For now, I will give a few more documented examples of atrocities committed by the Moscow occupiers against civilians. In early June of the same year, heavy artillery and mortars shelled a village in the Man Valley. And after the artillery shelling, an operation began during which ground troops destroyed houses and gardens, killing many people. In general, many other operations were also carried out without warning. As a result, around 60 villages near Kabul were fully or partly destroyed within 2 weeks in July. According to Testimonies, on July 10, 1980, Soviet troops killed civilians in villages near Kabul. Quote, in such numbers that their bodies lay scattered across the area for several days. At the end of July 1980, a group of Soviet soldiers in tanks was ambushed by Mujahideen near the village of Turani. The next day, as revenge, the Soviets shelled the village, killing about 50 people. Finally, in the summer of that year, the resistance of the local militia began to increase, which led to even greater brutality from the occupying army. In mid-August, the city of Herat was shelled, and it was reported that 3,000 people were killed in the attack. This was the most terrible attack on this city since the March shelling of 1979, after which 25,000 people were believed to have been killed. During the August attack, Soviet soldiers looted shops, especially those selling gold and silver items, for which this city was famous. I will discuss the Liberators' exploits as punitive measures later, on September 6th. After destroying 2 Soviet tanks, the Allied forces, heading to the village of Shakarman in the Alishan Valley, killed up to a dozen civilians, according to various reports. During the same period in the Kandahar region, the Soviets, confident that the resistance had been suppressed, attacked nearby villages to loot stores and gather fruit from local orchards. They were already attacked by the Mujahideen, who were in their hideouts. The Islamists killed many soldiers on the spot, and those who fled, along with reinforcements stationed nearby, retaliated by killing many people, including women and children. Another feature of this situation was that many of the leaders supported by the ruling alliance were actually from Kandahar, and they understood their inability to save the people in their home provinces from their comrades from allied regions. In October that year, after heavy losses, Soviet troops in Balan province retaliated by searching local homes and seizing valuables. Then they gathered the people found during the searches in one place, separated the loyalists and communists and shot the rest, throwing their bodies into pits dug by Soviet tanks. According to some claims, about 500 people were killed that day. At the same time, a Soviet armored unit was sent to Lagman. The Soviet soldiers, believing all residents here were Dushmans, enemies, started killing them during house searches for weapons and draft dodgers. Under this pretext, the occupiers seized valuable items. The number of victims, it is said, ranged from 350 to 1,200 people. For a week, corpses lay all over the region, and the survivors could not cope with the number of burials. In Shamalia, the Soviets killed several residents during multiple raids. The intensity of their operations was such that cows stopped giving milk and some children died from shock. In early May 1981, they killed several children in Kalakan, claiming the children would grow up to take up arms against them. In May 1981, Soviet soldiers destroyed Mahigaran, killing 31 villages in mosques, streets, and homes. And in August of the same year, they captured them nearby and set them on fire. Unable to overcome the resistance of the Afghans, by the end of 1980, the Soviet army decided to act more harshly, especially knowing that in January 1981, the American President Reagan was supposed to take office, who could provide the Mujahideen with weapons. It was decided to launch a decisive attack in winter 1981 to destroy the resistance village. I wonder if it's just me. This situation reminds me of the events at the end of 2024 when Russia decided to throw all its forces into the offensive in Donbas, and not just to strengthen their negotiation position before Trump arrives. Years pass, but the Kremlin's strategy stays the same. Mass killings and abductions. The very nature of Afghan society required frequent gatherings of civilians for prayers in mosques, for celebrating anniversaries or weddings, for funerals of loved ones. When the invasion began, gatherings became very dangerous. The Soviets saw any Afghan assembly, regardless of purpose, as potentially hostile. In mid-September 1980, hundreds of residents of the village of Ganjabad in Farah province were celebrating wedding ceremonies. But suddenly, they were struck by rockets fired from a group of combat helicopters, resulting in about 150 people being killed and dozens wounded. A year later, a similar incident occurred in the village of Jales as a result of a 2-hour attack by 4 combat helicopters. At the wedding party, 30 people were killed and 75 injured. Besides mass terrorist attacks, there were incidents of women being kidnapped, especially in Kabul. There were numerous incidents when, after nightfall, Soviet liberators took local women away in tanks and other vehicles. Over time, these incidents also started occurring during the day. These events mainly took place in areas near Soviet garrisons. Small groups would pick up young women on the streets, officially to interrogate them. But often, the true intentions were different. Such incidents became more and more frequent, and over time they began to worry families with young daughters. The scorched earth tactic. The longer the occupiers and their leaders failed to achieve their goals, the harsher their methods became, both against the rebels and the locals. For example, on December 18, 1980, a group of Mujahideen near the city of Alishang in Lagman destroyed a Soviet tank with officers inside. In response, the city of Alishang, the nearby village of Barzai, and the city of Islamabad were bombed. In Barzai alone, 16 people were killed. The tactics and motivation were painfully familiar if you know well the events of August 22nd to 23rd in Ukraine. Back then, as now, occupiers aimed to intimidate civilians so they'd pressure defense forces to stop resisting. However, in Afghanistan, the result was often actually the opposite. Even if the locals tried to persuade the Mujahideen to refrain from attacking the invaders, the Soviets still continued to kill civilians. People who lived near the main highways connecting Kabul with the provinces were especially unlucky in this regard. The idea of the Soviet troops was to destroy everything within 150 meters on both sides of the road in order to protect military convoys from rocket attacks by the Mujahideen, who often hid in nearby villages. Here are just two testimonies. In just one day, on October 9, 1980, the Russians killed 40 pedestrians along the road in Logar, trying to make the highway safe for their convoys. And in Unduz, Soviet army soldiers walked on the rooftops of houses at night and shot people inside for no apparent reason. Ordinary Afghans called the Russians barbarians or vakshi because of their inhumanity. In addition, there is evidence that Soviet army soldiers robbed trucks at their checkpoints, then sold the stolen goods, and also forced drivers to sell them marijuana. And judging by the frequency of such incidents, the number of soldiers who became drug addicts was significant. But we will return to this point later, relying on evidence published in the American press. In June 1982, Soviet troops killed 240 people in Baraki during a two-day unprovoked operation. Zakir Ghazi Alam, who hid in an underground canal along with others, described those events as follows. In every house there were moans and cries. New graves were being dug in the cemeteries. Barefoot and pale mothers and sisters, men and women were searching for their missing loved ones. The Russians carried out the most barbaric operation in this region. The eyes of people around the world are closed, their ears are deaf, and their tongues are silent in the face of this unprecedented crime by the Russians. There were also frequent incidents when Soviet occupiers fired at passenger buses for no reason, just for amusement. In December 1980, 11 people died and many were injured on a bus to Jalalabad. The Petkhwabeshan massacre in Afghanistan. I would like to highlight this terrible event separately. It became one of the documented horrific crimes committed by Soviet soldiers. It's quite difficult to find information about this crime. It's only available on the American Wikipedia and in publications in Western media. The events took place in early autumn of 1982. There was an underground irrigation canal near the village of Petkhwabeshana, which served as a water supply for the local farmers. In addition, in the center of the settlement, the farmers had cut out a staircase so they could go down to the canal and collect water for cooking and washing. At 7 a.m. on September 13, Soviet troops entered the village and began searching for people who were opposed to the Afghan authorities supported by the Union. To survive, the men and boys hid in the canal. The elders were told to bring them out, but claimed no one was there. However, the Soviets. The original Washington Post article used the word Russians. The commander ordered flammable liquid to be pumped through the wells, into the irrigation canal. Villagers who escaped said soldiers in gas masks poured unknown substances into the underground irrigation canal where they and their children were hiding. The investigation showed that the soldiers used gasoline, diesel fuel, and an incendiary white powder designed to make the gasoline burn properly. In the low-oxygen tunnel, powerful explosions occurred soon after. They shot those who tried to escape with machine guns, and earth and stones from the explosion covered the village. The Soviet soldiers remained in the village until 3 a.m., with their aircraft providing aerial cover. To prevent help from reaching the villagers, it took locals 7 days to recover all the bodies. The victims were so badly burned that relatives sometimes buried people who weren't their own family members. Thus, on September 13, 1982, in the Afghan village of Petkhwabeshana, Soviet soldiers killed 105 men, including 10 children among the dead. On September 17, 1982, Radio Kabul, under Afghan authority control, announced the elimination of counter-revolutionary elements near Petkhwabeshana. And on December 8, 1982, in Budrin in Sviatom operates CERT's NPC. 19 defeat Kabul Tobacco Detbak in the convention area. Depth, convention size count 35 panels. Parent of the State School Corps, but October year of sale IT radio inspectors. These are the words of Palla Hugen, chairman of the Norwegian Committee, who visited the Upper Kunar Valley in the summers of 1921-1922. I not only saw destroyed homes, I personally witnessed terrorist bombings. There was no trade, school, or medical help. The water supply was disrupted, the irrigation system badly damaged, and most residents left the farm for the mountains. It was dangerous for people and livestock to walk through the mountain passes. They had to be checked for small butterfly mines. When some of the population returned, the city was attacked from the air and set on fire without any reason. Consequently, all 3,000 residents of the city and nearby areas emigrated to Pakistan. According to Antonia A. Odegaard and Jamie Wrighton, two Norwegian women who spent a week in Jagori district in September 1982, the locals had become accustomed to air raids, and each family had their own shelters, one for each person, dug as small pits outside the house. All the children were instructed on what to do when the next attack happened and how they should run to the mountains. There can be no doubt that the air raids were aimed at the civilian population and occurred regularly. One of the most vivid descriptions belongs to Nicholas Danziger, a British art history teacher. All of Herat. Only one building remains untouched, and I saw no more than 10 residents there. To destroy this place, bombers came from Russia, and there were craters everywhere, even where there were no buildings. There was no pretense from the Russians that they were trying to hit the Mujahideen. It was a complete blitz all the way from there to Herat. There wasn't a single living person, absolutely no one. Chaos had stopped. Karbas looked like Hiroshima. You could see that there used to be a huge number of vineyards there, but now they've just turned into gray dust. Over 5,000 refugees settled in the nearby Iranian village within a year. In general, the intensity of Soviet military operations can be measured by the number of Afghans who fled abroad. By the middle of 1981, about 2 million Afghans had fled to Pakistan alone, and by the end of 1984, this number had exceeded 3 million. In 1991, the total number of Afghan refugees abroad was estimated at 5,670,000 people. And this number becomes even more striking when you know that before the Soviet invasion, the total population of Afghanistan was 15 million people, meaning that almost 40% of Afghans, according to official data alone, became refugees as a result of the help from the brotherly Soviet people. Swedish journalist Almqvist noted, "I entered a country where every village had been bombed at least once since the beginning of the war or shelled by Soviet ground forces." These areas are called helicopter territory because when you move through them and hear a helicopter, you have 60 seconds. These areas have returned to the Stone Age. Civilization has retreated. When you enter a village, you see a huge cemetery with new graves. The locals have started, just like in the old days, to hang flags as they used to do for holy people, because those killed by the Russians are considered holy people according to Afghan Islamic beliefs. Here's more evidence of the impact of Russian attacks on Kabul's suburbs. The Soviets attacked many villages with their forces, showing no mercy to anyone. The actual number of victims is unknown. They say it's impossible to count them. In many places, there were corpses lying here and there. No one dared to bury them. Dogs ate many of them. They decomposed and have an unpleasant smell. Some houses were destroyed, and others were closed because their residents had been wiped out. But in addition to the testimonies of Western missions, there are also articles from those years that tried to lift the veil on the horror that was happening on Afghan soil at the hands of the Russian Liberators. Publications in the foreign press include an article in the New York Times from March 1, 1985. It states that at a session of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, a report was made public saying that after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, there were gross violations of human rights there. According to the report, the occupiers carry out torture, mass killings of civilians, forced evacuation of rural areas, and the detention without trial of tens of thousands of political prisoners. In the report prepared by Felix R. Marker from Austria, the situation was described as follows. Many were subjected to torture and disappeared without a trace. Humanitarian norms were violated during the ongoing conflict, and the resulting situation poses a danger to the population overall. The report also lists numerous abuses during the Soviet occupation, including the targeting of children with booby-trapped toys, the mass destruction of agriculture, and the deliberate bombing of hospitals. Referring to Afghan witnesses are Makora cited 4 specific examples of mass killings of civilians between 1982 and 1984. For example, on October 12, 1983, in the village of Kulchabadbala in Kandigar province, 360 people were executed in the village square, including 20 young girls and about 24 elderly people. The speaker based these and other examples on evidence collected during a 9-day visit to Pakistan in December, where, according to the report, he interviewed refugees from 15 Afghan provinces. The Soviet invasion expanded the scale of violence in the country and led to targeted repression of people who opposed communist policies, including systematic bombing of villages that supported anti-Soviet resistance and a policy of terror directed against the civilian population. And do you know how the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics responded to this back in 1985? The Soviet Union, like the Afghan government, condemned the Commission's investigation as interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs. Brilliant. And here is an excerpt from an article in New Delhi from May 14, 1985. Soviet troops recently killed over 1,000 villagers in eastern Afghanistan. According to diplomats, Soviet troops, supported by about 200 tanks and armored personnel carriers, attacked a dozen villages in Lagman province east of Kabul from March 11 to 18. While searching for rebels, bodies were left everywhere and homes were looted and burned. At the same time, 3 high-ranking Afghan officials in nearby Jalalabad asked the Soviet army if Afghan troops could join the attack to reduce the number of casualties, but the Soviet side refused. And this is a truly unique article from August 3, 1984 in the New York Times, which tells about a press conference in New York held by 4 deserters from the Soviet army. The soldiers stated that indiscriminate killings of civilians, mistreatment of soldiers by their officers, and widespread disease became the main problems faced by the military. Some Soviet soldiers are so filled with rage that they kill everyone they see, said one of the deserters, 20-year-old Sergeant Alexei Perezleny. War is war, and a soldier is a soldier. The fighting is very indiscriminate. According to the information provided in this article, this was already the 3rd group of Soviet soldiers to desert to the West after the invasion began. Next, I'll provide a few quotes from this article. 20-year-old Private Sergei Zhigalin, who was an armored personnel carrier driver, recounted his friend's account of a mission during which an entire Afghan village was destroyed. The troops were ordered to take the village, but they couldn't capture it, so they requested air support and simply bombed the village to the ground. Commander of a 6-man crew operating a 120mm howitzer. We were told that we were sent to offer friendship and help to the Afghan people, but when you're sent to fight during peacetime, you can't feel good about it. Our soldiers are killing civilians, even though we were ordered to shoot only at Afghans with weapons. Frustration drives many to kill civilians as well. A 20-year-old sergeant who led a grenade launcher team. I can't hide the fact that women and children were killed, and I've heard about Afghan women being raped. In the same interview, the deserters admitted that young soldiers are often subjected to crimes and brutal treatment by senior servicemen. On my 2nd day, they beat me with a huge log for no reason. It's inhuman and brutal, so soldiers often seek revenge. Younger conscripts tried to kill senior privates by throwing grenades into tents and trucks. And here's another excerpt from the same article. Soviet soldiers also faced difficulties such as diseases, hepatitis, 3 types of typhoid fever, malaria, and dysentery. A deserter claimed nearly half the platoon was unfit for service. Are Soviet soldiers trying to overcome their fear, boredom, and frustration by smoking a common type of hashish or using opium and heroin? They buy drugs with money stolen from Afghan homes, as well as by selling army supplies, kettles, live and spent ammunition, spare parts, and automatic weapons. According to them, drug use among Soviet soldiers is a common occurrence even during combat operations. Almost everyone regularly uses hashish, and some use opium, but we just made sure the officers didn't see us. Looting and genocide. I'll give you some real testimonies that vividly describe how the Soviet troops behaved not with combatants, but with civilians during these actions. More and more often, the search for mujahideen was replaced by looting houses in search of valuables, Western or Japanese gadgets. On June 19, 1982, the Army of International Solidarity began a series of arsons, robberies, and murders. Looting was not an individual act, but a group one, typical for Russians, Vlaga. People said that the Russians took everything out of the houses, for example, radios, carpets, food, all kinds of household tools. These houses were completely empty. The Swedish journalist Alin Kvist, whom I have already mentioned, wrote, "In the winter of 1982, I met several prisoners in prison, each of whom had been robbed by several Russian soldiers at the same time in Lagar. According to the victims, the soldiers seemed to compete to rob the same person, as if medals were being awarded for it." This is his account of another incident. In the village of Baraki Rajan, the Russians first looted and then set fire to the stores. When the stores caught fire, they threw several elderly people inside. 9 people were driven out and killed in Ghulam Rezi's house, likely ending the entire family. Soviet soldiers also forced local residents to walk ahead of their tanks to prevent the Mujahideen from shooting at them. In 3 days of the operation in Barak Rajan, 298 people were killed, 25 of whom were children. Here's another case Almqvist heard from a local. The Russians put medicine in the wells so we couldn't drink the poisoned water. They destroyed piles of harvested crops in the fields. It was a common thing. They fired machine guns, Kalashnikovs, at piles of wheat or whatever else was in the fields to set them on fire. Mike Berry describes how Russian soldiers deprived the huge village of Aochekan of its wealth. The invaders apparently began the entire operation with this very goal on August 30, 1982. The entire village was surrounded in the classic way by tanks, with helicopters flying overhead. The young men eligible for conscription escaped in time, so Soviet troops only gathered elderly villagers, women, and farmers' children. This time, the soldiers didn't kill anyone. They just took everything valuable from every villager they could reach, whether it was jewelry or wristwatches. The houses were searched, and all transistor radios were confiscated. The barns were emptied, all the sacks of grain were loaded onto trucks, and finally, all the sheep, all the goats, and all the cattle were loaded onto military vehicles. The village was emptied of its inhabitants, since they had nothing left to live on. It wasn't bombed, and yet not a single living person remained there. He also testified that bombs continued to fall on the village in the following days, causing people to flee at night. 450 families reached Pakistan in 7 or 8 days. 50 children died from the cold crossing the mountains, and 150 people had frostbitten limbs amputated in Peshawar hospitals. The people collapsed onto a muddy field in the rain without tents, without shelter. In Pagman, on the outskirts of Kabul, there are rocky caves and trails leading into the mountains beyond. It was difficult for the Soviets to defeat the Mujahideen in this area, despite the numerous expeditions they undertook against them under the leadership of their officers. Groups of the invading army searched houses for weapons and valuables. When officers suspected locals of being Mujahideen or collaborators, they handed them over to Afghan loyalist officers to be killed. And even if the locals refused to kill their fellow countrymen, especially teenagers, the Soviet military would step in. A former Soviet Army sergeant's statement confirms this. "We didn't take any prisoners of war, not a single one. Usually we killed them on the spot as soon as we caught them. The officers ordered us to kill them." Chemical weapons. Well, perhaps the height of inhumanity can be considered the use of banned chemical weapons against unarmed Afghans. There are only a few examples of Soviet troops using chemical weapons. However, this can be explained by the fact that such incidents occurred in remote areas, where there was often no presence of foreign journalists or experts at all. Here are just a few testimonies where the bodies that were found had an unnatural appearance. On February 7, 1922, the bodies of 31 elders were found in a pit somewhere between the villages of Ayamak and Rabat in Ghazni province, decomposed within a couple of days. They were killed because the Soviets were met with hostility by the villagers, where the Soviets had shot a little boy in the fall of 1980. Several people were killed by chemicals after they entered an underground canal in the Shilgir area. Chemicals were injected into wounded Afghans, and within 20 minutes their bodies were almost destroyed. The Norwegian narrator of the film filmed in Afghanistan discusses the June 1980 chemical attack near Sharpur village in Paktia. "Retreating from the attacking helicopters, we left the village. When we returned 2 hours later, we found a man whom we had seen alive. When we left, his face was swollen, and the next morning his body looked as if he had died 3 or 4 weeks ago. The villagers said that the second wave of raids dropped bombs, after which there was an explosion and a yellow cloud. Based on the aftermath, this appears to be a new, extremely deadly gas. I will show evidence of its use against civilians. February 26, 1982. The occupiers, upon entering the village, killed women, children, and the elderly. They killed everyone they saw. There are numerous testimonies that gas was not used for the destruction. Many families lost loved ones, with bodies found in fields, mosques, alleys, and homes. The estimated death toll was 1 to 2,000. To celebrate their victory, the Russians gathered thousands of local residents for a rally, after which they put them on waiting buses and took them to Kabul. There, it was said, some were executed on suspicion of being mujahideen, others were conscripted into the army, some were later released, and most were imprisoned. There are cases where victims were found in combat positions, holding rifles, with their eyes open and fingers on the triggers, with no apparent cause of death. The Afghans, it was suggested, were exposed to a chemical toxin called sleeping death. This gas kills the victim instantly. According to Dr. Friel, in just the first 3 years, the Soviets carried out up to 100 uses of chemical weapons, resulting in the deaths of about 3,000 people, including civilians. These words confirm that the Soviet Union used Afghanistan as a guinea pig for its chemical warfare experiments. One of the most notable war crimes was the massacre in Lagman in April 1985, in the villages of Kasazizkan, Charbak, Balabak, Sabzadbad, Mamshukle, Haidar Khan, and Pulitzogi, where at least 500 civilians were killed. And there are dozens of similar testimonies, I emphasize, that have been documented. In the 1985 brochure, Life, Traditions and Customs of the Peoples of Afghanistan, the rules and norms of conduct for military personnel serving outside their country, which were distributed to Soviet soldiers, there was a mention of responsibility for war crimes committed through negligence, carelessness, or intentionally. Premeditated murder carried up to 10 years in prison, and with aggravating factors like intoxication, over 200 people were convicted. The death penalty also applied in some cases. According to official Soviet data alone, 6,412 criminal cases were initiated against internationalist soldiers in Afghanistan, of which 714 were for murder, 2,840 for selling weapons, and 534 for drug trafficking. Now, for comparison, here are figures from international experts. At present, the total number of Afghans killed during the 10-year war by Soviet troops and their Afghan allies is estimated at 2 million people. Conclusion. As a conclusion, I would like to share a short phrase I came across while researching materials for this topic. This is a quote from one of the Russian officers in Bulgaria. "We don't need people, we need land." This very clearly and precisely describes the actions that the Russian army carried out on Afghan soil for 10 years, the actions it had committed for centuries before that on conquered lands, and the actions it continues to commit. At this very moment, while you are watching this video in Slobozhanshchina, Donbass, and Zaporizhia. At the same time, I want to make it clear that there were soldiers in Afghanistan who truly became heroes and fulfilled their duty without looting or killing unarmed locals. But this does not change the fact that there were also those who committed inhumane acts, those who gave criminal orders, and of course those who sat and still sit in the Kremlin, spreading chaos on our planet. No matter what slogan the boot of the Russian occupier comes to your land under, its only goal will be your land. They can act without people, as neither their own nor locals' lives are ever valued. This is the whole brief essence of Putin's Russia, and even after him, I have no illusions that the very essence of Moscow's greatness will change. This was Semyon. Leave your comments and see you next time. Bye.